Hello, good evening. I'm Rima Dael, General Manager from WSHU Public Radio, and hello from the campus of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you this evening for Join the Conversation. But first, a quick thank you to our longtime partner, Books on the Common in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Now, I am thrilled to talk about hope and resilience this evening. But before we get on to all of the wonderful learnings that we can get from the real living Dr. Dolittle, Dr. Jane Goodall, I'd like to introduce my colleague this evening and good friend, Davis Dunavin. Good evening, Davis. Davis is a WSHU reporter, as well as our host for Off the Path. Over to you, Davis.
Thanks, Rima. Thanks so much. I'm really excited tonight to talk with Douglas Abrams. Excited to see so many folks here, so many folks on Zoom to listen in on this. So Douglas Abrams is a New York Times bestselling author, first of the Book of Joy, which stems from conversations with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, and now most recently of the Book of Hope, which comes from conversations with legendary naturalist, as she describes herself, and which we'll probably talk about, Jane Goodall, the wonderful Jane Goodall, one of my lifelong icons. Both of these books are part of the appropriately named Global Icons series. Douglas has also worked with Stephen Hawking and Nelson Mandela as well, and he's the founder of Idea Architects, a book and media company. Douglas, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
It's great to be with you, Davis, and great to be with everyone in the tri-state area where I grew up. So it feels like I'm talking to my hometown. So great to be with y'all tonight. You
are a native New Yorker, I believe, originally, right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And my folks lived in Connecticut for many years, so spent a lot of time there.
So you know the area very well. Well, you have a little a remark that I thought was very interesting about native New Yorkers in here that we'll talk about.
Yeah.
But to begin with, this is the second book in a series now. It's a Global Icon series, and it started with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu on the concept of joy. So we're seeing a theme: joy, then hope. But let's perhaps start to understand how you came to Jane Goodall to talk about hope. What originally brought you to the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu to speak on the thesis of joy?
Well, first I should say that I just have the most awesome job getting to speak with some of the most amazing people on the planet and bundle up their wisdom and share it with the world. And it's such an unbelievable privilege. And I had actually worked with Archbishop Desmond Tutu for almost 2 decades, worked with him on the Book of Forgiving and basically all of his books for the last kind of 15, 20 years, and had the incredible privilege of just companioning him and what he called the mementos of our friendship, giving these books to the world. And we were at his office for his birthday party, and a friend of mine who was connected with the Dalai Lama and I were talking about the idea of the two of them doing a book together. And I turned to Archbishop Tutu and I said, do you want to do a book with the Dalai Lama? And Arch turned back and he said, I'd do anything with that man. And they're just these incredibly wonderful, mischievous friends. If you've read the Book of Joy, or there's a film coming out called Mission Joy, which captures the footage from that week we spent together talking about joy. But it was just clear there were no two better people on the planet to teach us about joy and human happiness. And so that was the first book in the Global Icon series. And then after that, it was really clear that, and a part of that book was my bringing the science to, because they wanted it to not be a Buddhist book or a Christian book. They really wanted it to be a universal human book on the nature of happiness and joy. And I had always loved Jane Goodall, and she had been this, not only the world's most famous living naturalist, but I think personally, so many of us are experiencing great despair at this time. I know I have, and I really wanted to understand from Jane what it is that gives her hope, because she's been this kind of global ambassador for hope, and really wanting to understand, having looked so deeply at human nature, what in human nature, what in nature itself could give us hope.
Right. Jane Goodall, the author of a book. This is not her first book with hope in the title.
Yes.
As you said, a global ambassador of hope. Her book, Reason for Hope, was a very powerful one as well.
Yeah.
What was your first meeting with her like? How did you come into contact with her and then bond with her to work together on this book?
Well, so I got to fly to Tanzania, where she has a home in Dar es Salaam. And it turned out actually that on the airplane, I was sitting right behind her on the plane, just as things would happen. And her little monkey, famous monkey, Mr. H, was kind of out next to her on the plane. And so when we were getting off the plane, you know, she was kind of resting and reading and didn't want to disturb her. But as we were getting off the plane, I said hello and gave her a bottle of whiskey that I had brought for her, because she's a really big fan of Johnny Walker whiskey. And I knew I would have to train, because I'm not a big whiskey drinker, and I'd have to get prepared for the conversations. And so it was, that was the first time we connected. And then she just said, well, why don't you come around to the house and have dinner? And got to have dinner with her and her kids. And it was just super fun. It was to see her, this global icon, as mom and grandma, and, you know, kind of there with her family was incredible.
Well, it seems like hope begins right there, right? And like this place with this wonderful person who's done so many great things just at home, and sharing something as beautiful as just sitting down with somebody over some whiskey. You began your conversation by asking her, what is hope? As you said, she kind of has a definition of hope that is not what everybody thinks of necessarily. It seems like it's a little bit more active. How does she define hope?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, I went into it a little skeptically, to be honest, because as you were referring, I am a native New Yorker, and we don't really do hope in New York. We feel much more comfortable with skepticism, cynicism. You know, hope feels kind of fluffy and kind of like, let's hope for the best, and, you know, kind of really. And so, you know, I kind of was talking to her about, well, really, what is hope, and how does she see it? And one of the things she explained to me is that really hope is not fantasizing. It's not wishful thinking, which is, I think, what we think of often as hope. It's much more of active. It's much more, and actually it was interesting. We went to the scientists too. There's a whole field of hope studies, and they define hope as like, basically you can do three things when you're talking about the future. You can either fantasize, which is, you know, kind of, I'm going to be an NBA basketball player and play for the Knicks. That's a fantasy. We can dwell. That's what we did a lot of in New York, you know, like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And we can hope. And hoping has this kind of both thinking about the future, but it also has the anticipation of problems and problem solving in it. And the most amazing thing that she said in our dialogues about hope was that it's a human survival trait. So it's actually something that evolved in us. And actually the science seems to locate it in the prefrontal cortex. So it's like right there with language and problem solving and future thinking and time travel as something that allows us to move forward in our life. And the researchers were really clear that it's like the difference between success and failure. It's the difference between, you know, for our species, it may be the difference between survival and extinction. So it's much more powerful and solid and action-based and obstacle anticipating than I ever anticipated.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned it is such a human phenomenon. Do animals have hope? That's something that you asked her as well.
Yes.
Do animals experience this as well?
Yeah, so obviously one of the things Jane is most famous for is helping us to realize that we're in a continuum of intelligence and life, from, you know, kind of trees on to chimpanzees to humans, and that, we once thought we were kind of the pinnacle of creation, totally separate from all of the rest of life. And she helped us see that animals have emotions, animals have personalities, really scientifically show these things that that were really taboo at one point. And so she's not the person to kind of for human exceptionalism. And she said, look, think about your dog, your dog waiting at the front door for you to come home. That is a version of hope, right? They're like treats, walk. That is a kind of dog version of hope. But what we have with our amazing human intellect, as she described it, is this ability to hope for the distant future and to plan for that future, to anticipate, to work with others towards that future. And that is all about the nature of hope. And maybe to just jump in and say one other thing from the research that was so fascinating of hope was they basically said that to have hope, you need 4 things. You need to have goals. You need to have pathways to reach those goals. You need to have a sense of agency that you personally can attain those goals. And you need social support because none of us gets there on our own.
So we're learning a lot here about hope, that it is not just some sort of passive complacence. I'm going to sit here and wish for the best. For some of our younger viewers, and maybe others may be familiar with a meme that has circulated in recent years. I think we had this taped up in the office for a while, of a dog sitting drinking coffee in a burning building. The words under it that say, "This is fine." I don't know if you're familiar with that. But that's
that one, yeah.
That's denial, right? I mean, that's
right.
and that kind of that's real complacency.
Yeah.
In the book, you were just speaking to the first of her pieces of they're called evidence for hope. The first one being what you've been speaking to, the amazing human intellect.
Right.
What I think is interesting here too is that, my thought as a bit of a skeptic myself was, isn't it our intellect that has gotten us into so many of these problems? I mean, speaking to the one that obviously we're most concerned with here, climate change, not that that's by any means the only problem, but isn't it our intellect in some ways that has gotten us into some of these problems?
It's a great question. And it's actually one that I similarly asked Jane when she was talking about her first reason for hope, which is the amazing human intellect. And, she was very clear to say intellect and intelligence are not the same thing. No intelligent species would destroy its only home. And so we have not, the experiment in human intelligence has not yet been proven successful. That's an ongoing experiment. But the amazing human intellect is, fundamentally our problem-solving prefrontal cortex, our ability to send, people to the moon. When she goes out at night and she looks up at the moon, she sees that sense of hope of this is what we are capable of. Doesn't mean we're going to use that intellect for good, but it is certainly that ability of human problem solving that has created most of human civilization. So I asked her, well, look, hasn't that amazing human intellect got us into this mess, just like you were asking, Davis? And are we 51% good or are we 51% evil? How are we going to use that intellect? And she said something that just blew my mind. She said, so we're split down the middle, we're 50-50 and what determines which way we go is our environment. And suddenly what she was saying to me, where like the scales fell off of my eyes, was that all these things that we think of as human vices and evil, like greed and selfishness and violence and aggression, all of those things evolve to help us survive in certain circumstances. And so it's, suddenly it went from, oh God, we got to just tamp down the human vice in our, and somehow pump up the human virtue, to we have to create environments where actually the better angels of our nature are encouraged. And that to the extent that we create societies and schools and office environments where those other tendencies are encouraged or succeed, that's what we're going to nurture. And so that really kind of shifted my whole view on what the human project is about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, it is beginning to, we are beginning to find some encouraging thoughts here. In trying times, which, by the way, a survival guide for trying times, being the subtitle for the book. And this kind of brings us to the second point, which is her second reason for hope being the resiliency of nature.
Yes.
And to be a bit of a skeptic here myself and push back a bit as well. I want to hope. I do. I think we all do, right? But we all hear about things like speaking of climate change, we hear about things reaching points of no return. We have to act now. There's only a small window, as she says as well, to slow down biodiversity loss and climate change. But does that mean there's a limit to our hope? Because what happens if that window closes? I mean, I think as we're all afraid it could without action. Does that mean the end of our hope?
It's interesting. You're making me think about a conversation we had actually related to the power of young people when we were talking about Greta Thunberg. And, Greta, it goes to your comment about the dog in the burning building. And, Greta was like, I want you to act like your house is on fire. I don't want your hope. And I was like, so I said, what about fear and anger? Like, where do those? And Jane said, we need them all. We need fear and anger. We need outrage. We need action. Most importantly, we need action. But we're not going to have action without hope. Without hope, you have despair and you have inaction and passivity. In fact, one of the things I learned in this project is that cynicism, which is so comfortable, especially in my upbringing, is actually it's defeat. It's like it's giving up. It's surrender. And so hope is really the only thing that is going to activate that action. So, we also work with Christiana Figueres, who did the Paris Climate Treaty. We work with David Attenborough, and, many others who are very active in protecting biodiversity loss and climate. And yes, there are these thresholds, and I think it's really important that we know the severity of it. But I think it's really easy to hear all the negative news and then to become overwhelmed and feel like there's no hope. And, that this is why we can get to her fourth reason for hope, which, is, kind of indomitable in the face of those facts. But, I think that what Jane would say is, when it comes to the resilience of nature, which is your question specifically in terms of her reason for hope there, is that nature is incredibly powerful. And when we do very little, or even just leave it alone, it comes back. And we talked about all these ecosystems that have returned. And, the research shows that like ecosystems restore themselves in 10 to 50 years, depending on whether they're ocean ecosystems that come back more quickly or forest ecosystems. And so, really, it's a horrifyingly encouraging thought, which is like nature will go on. The question is whether this experiment in human life and our species will earn its place in the chain of life and become a welcome species versus an invasive species. And the difference that I learned between an invasive species and a welcome species is that a welcome species gives more to the environment than it takes. An invasive species takes more than it gives. So that's the move right now. That's what we need to learn how to do, is to develop a kind of regenerative orientation towards our environment and recognize that we are not separate from life. We're not separate from nature. There's no nature's resilience. But the powerful thing is that nature is resilient and so are we. And so because we are part of nature, and so when we take that shift, then we become so much more powerful. And Jane shall I tell the story about the survivor tree at 9/11 that Jane told me? It's such a beautiful story. Because as a New Yorker, I think we, and all who witnessed 9/11, it was such a deeply tragic experience where a lot of our hope and humanity, I think, and the future was shaken. And she went, and there was a tree that was basically shattered by the falling of the towers. and it had one branch left and was blackened branches and roots and dying. And it was taken by the Bronx Botanical Gardens, and it was nurtured back to life. And it's, like now this thriving tree that is, birds are nesting in. Jane comes to with children. She also told me this story about the trees in Nagasaki, these incredible 500-year-old camphor trees that were just, that it withstood an atomic explosion. And so I think they're just symbols of this incredible resiliency of life. Jurassic Park, in Jurassic Park, they say life will find a way, and it's kind of a warning to humanity, but it's also a sign of the incredible power of nature to bounce back. That is not to be complacent at all, there's a great deal of death and suffering of us and all species that will happen if we don't take action. But it is a sign that we are working, we are not alone in that struggle for nature's resilience.
Well, I love that. I love and hate that phrase you used. It was a horrifyingly.
It's a sign for human humility, though. I love it in that sense of just modesty in terms of humanity.
The world will survive. Will we?
Right.
But I think, as you said, we are part of the world, so we have that same resiliency. Let's talk a little more about, you mentioned Greta Thunberg, and I want you to help us understand the difference between these two perspectives. I think Greta Thunberg, to her credit, very strongly, I think, shocked and rattled a lot of people. And the severity of her message, that's literally saying, I don't want your hope, I want you to panic. Now that does seem to stand in some ways opposed to the Book of Hope, right? To say, I don't want your hope, but help us understand, because I understand that Jane met with Greta Thunberg. I think I saw in the book. Help us understand the perspective that each of these two people from such, one younger and one older coming at it from different angles. Help us understand their perspectives.
Well, I would start by saying that Jane's third reason for hope is the power of young people. She has incredible confidence in this next generation and future generations, because they have a whole different mindset about the urgency of dealing with our crisis and our crises. And one of the things that I think she would say is that this generation is like, I think we're often, we're basically not inheriting the earth from our ancestors. We are borrowing it from our children. And this is like, we are stewards and caretakers of this earth for our kids and grandkids and all future generations. And we, as Christiana Figueres will say, are at this pivotal decade when the decisions we make and the tipping points that we reach or don't reach will influence all the rest of life on our planet. It is a awesome and terrifying responsibility. And so we need, so I think what Jane would say is you can't live in panic, right? You can make decisions out of urgency, fear, outrage, as we must. And we must take action, and we must act like our house is on fire. I don't think she would disagree with that at all. But ultimately, what joins them together is the importance of action. And that really what gives you hope in the end is taking action. You can't there's no passive, passive hope. Then that's just wishful thinking. That is, let's hope for the best, which is really wishful thinking. That's not active, real, enduring hope. Real, enduring hope is you actually take actions that show you the efficacy of your capacity to make change in your life, in your own individual life, in an organization, or in a community, in our world. And that's what generates hope. And one of the fascinating things was I would say about hope and community is that one of the researchers was talking about the best measure of the resilience, of the well-being of a community was the level of hope in that community. And this other thing that was so fascinating that I learned was that really hope is a social gift. It's something we give to one another. So often one of us is despairing or feels hopeless or feels like we can't, get to our goals, or we're not going to get there together. And we inspire each other and remind each other of that capability to persevere, which brings us to the fourth reason for hope, I think.
I also want to ask a little bit more about her work with the younger generations, specifically this program called Roots and Shoots. Before we do, though, I want to take a little tangent here off of something you just said.
Sure.
Hope as a gift, giving people hope. Who are some? I love the stories in this book of people who gave Jane Goodall hope and who gave you hope as well. I'd like to help us understand how we can give hope. I mean, I think that's one of the best things we can do in life, right? That's one of the best gifts we can give. Can you share some of the stories of people who have given both Jane and yourself hope?
Sure. Gosh, I'll just start with a very personal story, which is that when I was working in Tanzania with Jane, my dad went into the hospital and I had to fly back right away to New York. And, my dad, he was diagnosed with T-cell lymphoma and really given a very short window to live. And my son had just had a surfing accident where he was hit by somebody's board and had a traumatic brain injury. And so I'm kind of flying back and forth between California and New York with my son and my dad. And I think, their ways in which they faced their crisis. I think it's really about, hope is often we get hope from watching people endure these great challenges. And, my dad said this beautiful thing, when he decided, it was clear that it was terminal. And he said, it's time to accept the inevitable. And he thanked me for companioning him on his mighty journey to death. And, there was this, and like 5 years before, he had a traumatic brain injury. And he, when he came, we didn't think he was coming back. He was in the ICU for a month. And my brother said to him, "I'm so sorry when he finally came back that you had to endure this incredible hardship." And he said, "No, not at all. This is all part of my curriculum." And it was just this incredible reminder of the power of adversity. And I think that's the, part of how we lose hope is we don't realize like that embedded in hope is that ability to overcome obstacles and those enormous challenges in ourselves and in our world. And Jane, the fourth reason for hope is this indomitable human spirit, what she calls it. And she shared with me her incredible stories of people who have, lived without arms and legs, people who have, reforested, and brought species back from the brink. My grandfather, he was an amputee. He lost his leg in a trolley accident in New York and became a ballroom dancer and a neurosurgeon who separated one of the first conjoined twins. And he used to say, "The difficult is hard, the impossible just a little harder." So Jane would talk about, and I think this is the amazing thing about learning from our elders as well, which is they've been through times of enormous adversity, right? Like World War II, there's the rise of fascism now, there's Russia in Ukraine, there's China, there's, fascist elements in our own nation. But this was a moment in human history during World War II when Jane was growing up, when literally the free world was on the brink of extinction. And we were talking about this greatest generation, as they're so called, who won the World War II. And they became the greatest generation because of the enormous adversity that they faced. And so we have the greatest adversity perhaps since that time, and maybe in all of human history, because never before has human survival been in the equation. And we will need to rise to become the greatest generations to meet the challenges of our time. And it's daunting, but it is actually incredibly inspiring when we see that I do a lot with film and TV and novels, and they say a hero is only as good as the forces of adversity they face. Or a hero is only as strong as the forces of adversity that they face. And we individually and collectively are facing a lot of adversity now, and it will call us to our greatness if we are going to survive these times.
Exactly. I did want to briefly discuss the program that she has worked on for
Yes.
almost more than actually 30 years, Roots and Shoots, working with young people. What does she do?
So she has this amazing, it's called like kind of Generation Jane. She's got these groups around the world that she started where young people create these Roots and Shoots programs in schools or in communities, even in colleges, where they do something positive for either humans, animals, or the environment. It is this extraordinary program to get kids active and to see their own agency, to see their own efficacy, to give them hope, to give them a sense of their power. And many of these cohorts of Roots and Shoots are now in government. The minister of the environment in Tanzania was in a Roots and Shoots program. She's got this kind of Jane's army, if you will, of these legions of activists and who are out there really fighting for the good of humanity, of animals, and for the environment.
Obviously, hope is a wonderful thing, perhaps the best of things. Who was it that said, I think, but it's not something we can maybe carry all the time. You asked her at one point if she'd ever lost hope. What did she say?
She said that when her second husband, Derek, died, that she lost hope for a period of time, and that really what kind of nurtured her back to hope was this social gift that we talked to. It was her friends and her relationships, even her dogs, and ultimately the forest. It was going into nature and seeing the power just went off here for a second. Can you still hear me now?
I can still hear you. Fine.
Okay, great.
Our audience can still hear me.
Okay, great. It flickered here for a second. And she went into the forest and she found hope again in the forest. And I think there is something about witnessing the cycles of life. I asked her, speaking of death, I asked her about her next great adventure, and she said it was going to be dying. And I just, it's this kind of, you see Jane kind of there with her notepad and, her binoculars, kind of, okay, now let's see what lies after life. It's this kind of amazing image that I came to mind of her, kind of, seeing what, and this is kind of an amazing thing that we talked about, and that's in the indomitable human spirit, is she does feel like human consciousness goes on beyond our body, and that there's something greater than just these earth suits that we live in, which she's not going to prove one way or the other, but it was interesting to hear her talk about that kind of trajectory of possibility even beyond life.
Mm-hmm. That was going to actually segues very nicely into my last couple questions for you, and it's about the role that spirituality plays here. Now, like you said, we're not talking about one particular denomination or religion, but we're also not talking about your sort of traditional materialistic atheism. It sounds like spirituality is important for her, but I don't hear a lot of definitions and dogma there.
Yeah, I asked her what's the difference between hope and faith, because I think those are two things that people often confuse. And Jane said that, faith is really about a doctrine. It's about a belief. It's about, I believe in a God. I believe in, this catechism, whatever your belief and faith is. I mean, if that was just as an aside to go back to the Book of Joy for a second, it was like we were sitting with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu for that week was like sitting at the spiritual mountaintop where the world's religions meet, and the dogma falls away and you see kind of really what is the universal human spiritual teaching of life. It was really so powerful. But in Jane's case, I'd say, what she said about hope is more humble. It's not like this is the way the world is. This is the way the world could be. This is the way my life could be. This is the way I could.
Douglas, you've frozen on my end. I don't know if we may be having technical difficulties.
Okay, we've.
Are you back? There we go.
I am back. Yes. So sorry about that. Yeah.
It's okay.
So did you, I was just saying that, that hope is more humble, and that it's not, knowing the way it is, it's the way it could be. And it's about a belief in the possibility of creating something different in the future. It's really, that's why it exists right here in the prefrontal cortex, kind of on this intersection of problem solving, language, time travel. It's where we kind of envision the future of our lives and of our world and say, wow, we could go to that moon. I could be this kind of person. I could open a bookshop in Ridgefield County, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. I could, that is a hope. That is a dream that we have. And then we get there having realistic goals, pathways, agency, and social support.
And good, nice little call out to books on the cover. My last question for you before we open it up to a few questions from the audience.
Sure.
This is part of a series. Not to ask you to show your hand, as I'm sure you have ideas that are percolating, but yeah. Can you give us an idea of where one might go after this, beginning with joy?
Yeah.
Then looking at hope. Joy, by the way, joy in changing times, which was the full subtitle of that book, hope in trying times.
Right.
Where might we go from there?
Is a great question. And I will say that there are ideas, but nothing definite. We welcome your audience's kind of ideas. And they actually can come visit, they can come email us on our website, or join us on ideaarchitects.com, and which is the home of the agency working with visionaries, creating a wiser, healthier, more just world. And that's where the global icon and Davis, are we back? We're back.
We're back. I'm back. Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, great. And so at ideaarchitects.com, people can email us and give us suggestions for who they think we should work with. I will say we're talking about with amazing, epic, century renowned musicians all the way to presidents, just. I think it's so powerful to really find, what we're looking for though, is the person who has a deep insight into some aspect of the human experience that they have spent their life in the service to or devoted to, and can share with us something, whether it's creativity or love or whatever the friendship, the human value, that can illuminate some aspect of our humanity. And I think, that's one of the most wonderful things I get about the Book of Joy and the Book of Hope, is that people say, before these were just famous, iconic people. In reading these books, I feel like I've seen their humanity, and I've kind of sat down and really had tea or sipped whiskey with them, depending on the context. And I think that's really high praise, is that you see that that playfulness, that joy of the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Tutu.
I'm sorry if we're still having more technical difficulties here, folks. I'm sure, like the past 2 times, I have hope that it will come back and we will have Douglas back again. Doug, can you hear us? You
I
back?
can. I am back. I'm so sorry about that. I am traveling overseas and on the hunt for truth. And
Well, this is a good example of hope, right? I mean, we are running into trying times. We're running into adversity here, and we're powering through it. And we just keep trying again. It's resilience.
Awesome. Yes, exactly.
Let's take a few questions now. And on the question of resilience, we have one from Rima, from our general manager, who asks, what do you do for your own resilience? What influences you to regroup, to get pace, and to be resilient in your own life?
Thank you, Rima. That's a great question. I think, I'd break it down into 3 pieces. There's, what do I do for my human intellect? What do I do with where do I find hope, the social gift of hope and resiliency, so in relationship, and then nature. And I would say, so first, really, like, there's so much chaos that comes at us on a constant basis, so much noise. The Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu said it's only news because it's unusual, it's rare. It's like the murder, the mayhem, there's so much more good that's happening on planet Earth, but it's not in the news because it's like people being helped in a hospital for COVID, these incredible. And so I think it's about remembering the proportionality and then actually doing, in the Book of Joy, we have these joy practices that were there, Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu's joy practices, and I do those. And those help enormously. And the first part of that is about perspective and keeping the heartache and the heartbreak in perspective. And that's been huge. And really seeing the kind of long history of humanity and, seeing that like it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back for humanity. Ukraine is a definite step back for humanity, right? But that doesn't mean that we're never going to get to a world beyond war. And if you look at the trend lines, the amount of violence and death at the hands of other humans is really quite dramatically reduced. So I think that's what I do for my mind, and those daily practices are hugely important. So I'm a terrible meditator, but I do try to do those moments and minutes of my day, and then I reach out for hope for others when I'm honestly this last week, for a whole variety of reasons, was really challenging, and it was really amazing to have those relationships and that love that we have from those people that like our hope circle. Who are those people in your life who like really believe in you and give you agency and really remind you, like, who can, Oprah says it, who can be there in the breach, when things are hard, and who can be there with you when, for the celebration. And those people who just have, are the wind at your back. So that, and then I would say just, so I grew up in Manhattan, like not a lot of nature around. But I have come to desperately rely on nature to remind me, and even honestly, if it's a plant in your house, like we work with a neuroscientist named Mark Berman, who talks about the power of nature to reset our attention and our creativity. And so getting out to nature, there's an amazing story. Do I have time for a 30-second story that Jane, it was in the Book of Hope? So Ashley Consolo is this incredible researcher who's up working in the tundra with the Inuit people. And she's hearing all these stories about climate change, and she, and people's lives dramatically disrupted by the realities of climate change, and her hands freeze up. She can't type anymore. She can't use her hands, and she goes to all the specialists, and the specialists say, we can't find anything wrong with your hands. And finally, she goes to this Inuit elder, and he says to her, "You are intellectualizing your grief," right? We talk about eco grief in the book, and you have to feel your grief. And you need to go into the forest every day, put your hands in the stream, and let your grief go into the stream. And she did that for a week, and her hands were healed. And I just think that is a reminder of the fact that we need, within ourselves, within our relationships with nature, we need to allow ourselves to feel that fear, to feel that anger, to feel that sadness, that grief, and recognize that those are actually aspects of our humanity that allow us to move forward in our lives.
I got to say, I hope someone's taking notes here, because I'm learning so much from this as we're going. I mean, these are things we just need to get through life, but to make the world a better place. Things that we can all do, and it's wonderful. We have a couple more questions. One from Catherine, and I'm just going to read this word for word from Catherine, who asks, "What part can we elderly, concerned people do to be a positive presence in the world, holding out hope when some of us are often housebound and mentally deteriorating?"
Well, I think it's first to acknowledge that we desperately need our elders, and the power of young people is extraordinary. The power of our elders is extraordinary as well, and we need every generation. And I think what our elders can do is, they are those reminders of perspective. They're the ones who have often seen enormous hardship and adversity. And I think their stories are very powerful. I think their love is very powerful, their confidence in the next generations. And honestly, just, like my parents-in-law are suffering from Alzheimer's and dementia, but they just love. They're not in the future, they're not in the past, but even their just exquisite presence in this moment, and that love and that ability to appreciate and bless the moment is a gift. So I think that is something that no matter what your mental or physical capacity, you're always still in relationship, and that connection is so powerful and so important.
From David Phelps, we have this question, and this taking a bit of a turn here from the last one. But how has the COVID experience affected your view of hope?
So I think that COVID deeply challenged so many of us. I think there's so many things to say about COVID and what it's done to our society and our world, and increasing alienation and isolation and loneliness and depression and anxiety. It really has exacerbated a kind of mental health crisis for so many people. 40% of people are experiencing symptoms of anxiety and depression. It's like 60% for people under 25. So it's really. But I think it also has shown us that our world can move incredibly quickly to create solutions and deal with crises. And I think it's also what Jane said when I was working with her during the pandemic was, this is a reminder of, this is a zoonotic illness, a zoonotic virus that comes from animals in the wild to humanity because of our abuse of the wild. And it is a reminder of that interconnection. Like you can't destroy the natural forests in China or anywhere else, and somehow it's not going to impact you, or and so and it just is a reminder of what the Buddhists call interdependence, what Arch calls and the African cultures call Ubuntu. Or basically we just know it at the biological level of our deep connection with one another. I think in terms of what it's done for me and Hope is it has challenged I think our distraction with COVID and our political crises have taken us away from the really burning issue, literally, of our times, which is climate. And so I think it has challenged my sense of hope in that we need to be redirecting it toward that. But I think it has shown me that when we work together to solve our problems, it's just another extraordinary example of the amazing human intellect.
An interesting comment from Lori L here. And maybe just something for us to think about and think about what we can learn from this. But Lori L says about nature, which this is going back to our conversation on nature's resiliency.
Sure.
We all saw how smog and pollution cleared away in a few months over several cities when the world was in lockdown during the initial months of the pandemic. What do you think we can learn from that?
I do. I think that's an amazing point as well, and something that Jane and I talk about is just that it's like, this is what we were talking about, kind of life after us. If God forbid we don't do what we need to do, it's like life's going to come back. Life is going to kind of reclaim the commons, if you will, if we don't tend to it. And I think that was, it was super, it was wild to see, wild animals kind of reclaiming our city streets. And so I think it was a real reminder of kind of when we tamp down human activity. And look, I think we need coexistence. We need rewilding. We need to be bringing, corridors of life and biodiversity into our cities like they do in Singapore, for example. We need to be recognizing that, there is no human thriving when the earth is not thriving. And I think that the lockdown was just a reminder again of that kind of relationship that we have with the wild and with the natural world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there are a lot of great examples that are mentioned in the book of that, by the way, too. There's a lot more we could talk about there. I have one more question, and I'm not sure, we may have time for more after that, but I have one more right now.
Sure.
From Adeline, and Adeline, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, Adeline Distasia. But Adeline, we have a question from Adeline. Jane Goodall speaks about hope, but don't you think it's more of an engine of love? This is interesting because maybe love is another one of our global icons books. But
yes.
What do you think of that? An engine of love?
It's it's so beautiful. Angeline, thank you for the question. I think that, love as we experience it, we know it at least to be a mammalian reality, right? Like, that's, it's a deep, it's extraordinary. There is nothing stronger than our love for our children. I worked with the biologist on a book on whales and a novel on whales called Eye of the Whale. And, and I was like, what is it in us that could save us? That was my question. And when I went to the biologists, and this was before I started working with Jane, that's what they said. It's this mammalian instinct of the parental love for their children, which is the strongest force in our world, basically. Is it, the question is it stronger than ignorance, fear, and greed? But if anything's going to save us, it's that love. And I think that, hope is fundamentally an act of love. It's an act of kind of loving ourselves and loving the future. Like it's love over fear. And there's this this hope researcher who says we are fear hope animals, or either like in our hope, which is in the frontal cortex, or we are in our fear, which is kind of our reptilian part. But I would say to Angelina's question that it's, we're kind of fear love creatures too, like we're either in that space of love or we're in that space of fear. And I think, those love centers of our brain are so deeply connected, I think, with hope. But I haven't investigated it, but it's inspiring. Thank you.
Hope is an act of love. We have one more quick question.
Sure.
They keep coming here. One more quick question. This is a bit of a shared question from Judith and Barbara. How do we have hope and take action in challenging times?
Well, I think as we were saying at the beginning, Jane says there's no hope without action. So again, it's just like, let's hope for the best. Passive, not real hope. That's a fantasy. To really have hope, we have to turn it into action. And the only thing that really sustains hope over the long haul is action. Right. So it's really those actions, those getting active in your local community, making changes in your community, voting for the right candidates. This book that we did with Christiana Figueres, which is called The Future We Choose, which is this extraordinarily beautiful book on the two worlds that we're choosing between and who we need to become, the three mindset states that we need, and the 10 actions that we need to take to transform our world and really take advantage of this most crucial decade. And, like some of those actions are getting politically active. We need to vote for those candidates. We need to change the legislature in such a way that because it has to be massive national and global change. It's about stockholder activism. It's about one of our authors is a green activist who was the head of he was the Assistant Secretary of Energy for the United States. And brought in renewable energies and the LED light bulb and gave Tesla its first, and he's now been elected in a shareholder takeover to the Exxon board. That's transforming, the company of the Rockefellers that, basically was responsible for so much of the disinformation about climate change. So those are the kinds of actions we need to take personally. Look at Jane Fonda, talking about elders who are leading the way, who have Fire Drill Fridays, who's out there, protesting and demanding action. So I think, each one of us can do our part. And, I would say it does, it can be from so incredibly joyful and inspiring to be a part of the solution.
Well, Doug, thank you so much. I hope that for our listeners, for our audience, I hope everyone is coming away from this feeling, I'm repeating myself here, but feeling more hopeful. I certainly am. We all know the hard times the world has gone through and is going through, but it is as more important than ever not to despair, not to fall into cynicism, and to embrace and to understand what hope is. So Doug's book, Douglas Abrams's book, The Book of Hope, you're probably seeing it mirror imaged for me, but such is the case. The Book of Hope, a survival guide for trying times, with Jane Goodall. Doug, thank you so much for being here.
So great to be with you, Davis, and to be with everyone. Thank you so much for your time.
And thanks everyone else. Check out WSHU.org or follow us on social media for info about upcoming events, our podcasts, our programs. Don't forget to check out our official bookstore partner. And again, thanks for the mention, Doug. They are Books on the Common in Ridgefield. Wonderful store. Thanks to everyone, and stay tuned for the next event.